Welcome. My name is Daniel Wasserman Soler, and I am the director of the Lumen Christi Institute. Thank you very much for joining us for this evening's lecture. The Lumen Christi Institute was established in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago who thought that the Catholic intellectual tradition had something to offer to one of America's great secular universities. I was a student at this wonderful university in the early 2000s and was able to benefit from the Lumen Christi Institute and the great Catholic environment at this university. And our hope continues to be to enrich the great educational experience that is offered here at the university with the insights of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Tonight's event is entitled How Can We Flourish? And we'll hear a little bit more by way of a formal introduction for Dr. VanderWeele in just a moment. First, just a few details about tonight's event. It is live streamed and recorded, so we will have time for Q&A afterward. We'll take some questions from the audience, and then we hope to take some questions as well from the live stream audience too. Hopefully the technology will continue to cooperate for us. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors who helped to make this event possible. First, I'd like to thank the Department of Public Health Sciences here at the University of Chicago for helping us secure this lovely space for tonight's event. And I also would like to thank the program on medicine and religion at the University of Chicago for helping us to promote this event. And finally, I would like to thank our sister institutes. There is a large number of Catholic institutes at secular universities across the country that are also promoting this event, particularly the live stream event. And they are the Collegium Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, Fons Vitae at Duke University, the St. Anselm Institute at the University of Virginia, the Nova Forum at the University of Southern California, and the Kateri Institute at the University of Michigan. And finally, I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for providing funding for this event. If you like our work, one of the things you can do, besides telling your friends about our programs, is to continue to come to our events and to share them with others. On February 2nd, we will have a lecture about Hannah Arendt and the Catholic influences on her thought. February 10th, we will have a Red Mass for members of the legal community. Lawyers, law students, and anyone who's interested is welcome to come. And we will have a Mass, a Red Mass that's for members of the legal community, and again, but open more broadly. And we'll also have a lecture following it called When Witches Litigate. And it's the story of how a group of 17th century witches in Spain won their trial against people who accused them of witchcraft. A fun twist on legal history. And then on February 17th, we will have a White Mass in partnership with Calvert House and St. Thomas the Apostle Parish. And the lecture that follows that event will be called Catholicism and Healthcare. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Daria Esterhazy, Assistant Professor in Pathology and also a member on the Committee of Cancer Biology, who will introduce our speaker.
All right, good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tyler VanderWeele. So Dr. VanderWeele, as the slide already says, is a professor in epidemiology in the departments of epidemiology and biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is also the director of the Human Flourishing program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion at Harvard University. So human happiness and well-being and what it takes to achieve it is subject to investigation in a broad spectrum of disciplines, ranging from philosophy, theology, psychology, to social sciences, politics, economics, medicine, public health, biology, and probably more. That's just what I could think of. But regardless, each field tackles at times profoundly different aspects of well-being, and each field has its own definitions, measures, and standards. Dr. VanderWeele, however, having trained in a multidisciplinary manner, both at Oxford and Harvard, and having studied theology, philosophy, mathematics, economics, and obtained his PhD in biostatistics, felt that none of these disciplines on their own could ever come to a golden formula of well-being of body and mind, or human flourishing as he coined it. And so he has thus redefined the question as an interdisciplinary one and poses it as such by studying, for example, the causal relationship between religion and health and well-being, but using data-driven approaches and including biostatistics. This holistic approach of human well-being has been acknowledged by several prestigious awards and grants, such as the Timo Spiegelman Award of the American Public Health Association, but also going all the way to the other spectrum by the election as a fellow of the International Positive Psychology Association and the International Society for Science and Religion, and by being the co-director of a 7-digit multi-institutional grant of the Global Flourishing Study. So finally, Dr. VanderWeele has disseminated his insight in hundreds of peer-reviewed articles, but also books, such as the Handbook of Religion and Health and Measuring Well-Being, both published at Oxford University Press, but also through more lane news outlets such as CNN, CBS, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. As a natural scientist, keeping religion a private affair, I am particularly looking forward to hearing from you, and I would like to ask all of you to join me in welcoming Dr. VanderWeele this late afternoon.
Well, thank you, Darian and Danny, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks also to the Lumen Christi Institute for hosting this event, along with my former department, the Department of Public Health Sciences. It really is a privilege and honor to be able to return once again to this very fine institution. So I will be speaking this evening on how can we flourish. I'll offer a few remarks on the notion of flourishing and talk a bit about some of our admittedly somewhat crude assessments of flourishing and how we've made use of these in a variety of contexts, both for descriptive and more theologically research-oriented purposes. I will then transition to questions about how we can promote flourishing. Both at the individual level, various activities for flourishing, but also thinking about the important role of communities and of institutions. And while I'll be addressing that topic more broadly, since this is a Lumen Christi event, I will be giving special attention to the role of religious communities as well in that discussion. And then I'll offer some concluding remarks and some of the work and thinking we've been doing in future directions where I think further inquiry into these questions of flourishing will be important. An overview of some of the work I will be presenting can be found in this 2017 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and some of the more individually focused activities for flourishing in this paper in the Journal of Positive Psychology and Wellbeing. And then lastly, I really do want to acknowledge the collaborative work of very many researchers at the Human Flourishing Program. None of this would be possible without being able to work with such an extraordinary group of people. So I want to make a few remarks on the Human Flourishing Program before beginning the formal content, simply because so much of this has come out of the work of the entire team. But the Human Flourishing Program was founded at Harvard in 2016 with the twofold aim to study and promote human flourishing, and then also to develop systematic approaches to the integration of knowledge across disciplines. So we've, from the very beginning, had a strongly interdisciplinary focus on our research staff. We have not only psychologists and sociologists and public health researchers and those in education, but also philosophers, theologians, a historian, even, all working together to try to approach this topic of human flourishing in an interdisciplinary manner. We have a staff of about 20 researchers now. We are about 2/3 grant funded, 1/3 donor funded, but we do very much need supporters to keep us in business. We are formally part of Harvard University, so a gift to the Human Flourishing program is a gift to Harvard. So if you or friends of yours are about to give up on the university, given the chaos of the past few months, please let them know that we exist, and they can helpfully redirect their contributions rather than abandoning them to the fine work that we're doing. And with that, I will begin the more formal content. So many of our institutions and academic disciplines often aspire to grand visions of flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics is sometimes described as an attempt to study how agents go about maximizing their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of an agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology is sometimes defined as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But in practice, many of our discussions, many of our studies are often restricted to very specific disease states, simple measures of feeling happy, or to income, missing the very broad, expansive visions that some of these descriptions provide. So what is flourishing? Well, if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines flourishing as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's the word often used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing program is that flourishing, or complete human well-being, is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, very all-encompassing, but this is arguably what we're seeking in as individuals and ought to be pursuing as a society. I think the discipline that's come closest to trying to capture this sort of expansive notion of flourishing is that of positive psychology. Numerous measures and conceptualizations of well-being have been put forward. But notably absent from pretty much all of these conceptualizations and measures of psychological well-being is any notion of physical health. And are we really fully flourishing if we're bedridden or terribly ill? We can certainly flourish in particular ways, but are we fully flourishing without physical health as well? Missing from not all, but most of these conceptualizations and measures are also any notion of character or virtue, contrary to Plato or Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really cultural, philosophical, religious traditions worldwide. Some very good cross-cultural work making this clear, that this notion of character features prominently in most understandings of well-being or flourishing across the globe. But with a notion so expansive, we might wonder, is it ever possible to really achieve consensus on this? Is it ever possible to measure this? Surely understandings of flourishing are going to vary across individuals, across different cultures and philosophical and theological traditions. So can we really make progress on this? And well, I would certainly acknowledge that any well-developed understanding of flourishing is going to vary across traditions. I think it is also the case that any reasonable notion of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that human flourishing is reducible to these 5, but whatever else flourishing might consist in, it would include these 5 domains as well. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but that each is arguably a part of it. I think each of these domains also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this now as well. And each is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake and not merely as a means to some other end. And I do think these 2 criteria of being nearly universally desired and being an end might help shape some consensus around what to measure, even in a pluralistic context where well-developed conceptualizations of flourishing do differ. So as a short, crude assessment of flourishing, we've taken 2 questions from each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing work on well-being, questions that are in widespread use already and that have received at least some degree of empirical validation. The only 2 questions that are newly proposed in this assessment were the 2 questions around character. And while there's been, I think, a great deal of very good work done on character assessment over the last 2 decades, most of these are very long assessments for single character strength, 20 questions to assess courage or creativity. There was very little that was more global in scope. So we worked with philosophers to develop a couple of questions based on the tradition of the cardinal virtues that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4, practical wisdom or prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, temperance or moderation. So the 10 questions are as followed. First question on life satisfaction. That first domain, recall, is happiness and life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Self-reported, 0 to 10, 0 not at all satisfied, 10 completely satisfied. This is perhaps the most widely used question in the well-being literature. It's been used by the OECD, it's used in the UK's annual survey, it's been used by Gallup, it's been used by numerous cohort studies, it's in this year's National Health Interview Survey here in the United States. And so this is more of a cognitive evaluative assessment, and then we supplement that with something more affective about feeling happy in general. How happy or unhappy do you usually feel? From 0 extremely unhappy to 10 extremely happy. The second domain is physical and mental health. These are just standard self-report health questions from the US General Social Survey, the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health, 0 to 10? How would you rate your overall mental health, 0 to 10? Third domain, meaning and purpose. First question here, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0, not at all worthwhile, to 10, completely worthwhile. This question also is very widely used by the OECD. Once again, the UK's annual survey, many cohort studies have employed this as well. And then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life, rated from 0, strongly disagree, to 10, strongly agree. The fourth domain, character in virtue. The first question, very crudely, trying to get at notions of practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, completely untrue of me. 10, completely true of me. And then second question, trying to get at, again in some very crude way, notions of fortitude and temperance. I am always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness assessments. First question here, I am content with my friendships and relationships. 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. This is, in some sense, trying to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then secondly, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to assess, in some sense, the quality of those relationships. So in most of our work, we look at these domains separately because, as you'll see, the dynamics can be quite different across the 5 domains. Sometimes we will average the 10 scores together as a measure of composite flourishing, but really this should be understood as nothing more than the average of those 5 more meaningful domains. We do typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. And these 2 questions, drawn from the financial well-being literature: how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? And sometimes we'll average all 12 questions to form a more secure measure of flourishing, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources are arguably means, not ends, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice as indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. I won't bore you all here with the psychometric properties of this assessment, but for those who are interested, happy to follow up further. I will be talking about some of the research uses we've made of this assessment, but I think it has value also with regard to opportunities for self-reflection and self-assessment, to think about what is going well and what is not going well, identifying areas one wants to work on towards improvement, changes one might want to make in life, tracking over time how are things changing. And I think this can be done both at an individual level, but also within particular communities or contexts to see what's taking place in those communities, who's doing well, who is not, who needs help, and in what ways, and how are things changing over time. So when we've employed this in various workplace, clinical, educational settings, some of the feedback we've had are, some of the questions made me stop and think, or it was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on. Relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. Missing a greater purpose. Need to reach out to help more and give back. One woman, after taking this assessment, said after years of kind of going back and forth, she finally decided to commit to a volunteering activity that she had been thinking about for some time. So before I go on to talk about some of the research we've been doing using this assessment, I want to break for 2 minutes and give you all an opportunity to reflect on these questions with regard to your own life. Don't worry, I won't be collecting data here, but I'll pause for 2 minutes to give you all a chance to do some reflection as well. Okay, so I realize 2 minutes is not a great deal of time, but hopefully you've had a moment or two to reflect on life. But I do want to move on to questions of how can we make use of these sorts of assessments? What can we learn? And I think even descriptive statistics can be quite illuminating in this regard. This data is roughly nationally representative samples of the United States on the Flourishing assessment immediately prior to the World Health Organization's declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic in January of 2020, and then 6 months later in June of 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, the average assessment in the United States, really across the domains, was about 7 out of 10, with the exception being financial and material stability, nearly a full point lower. And this has often been the case in many of our samples, that people are struggling considerably with those means. Unsurprisingly, flourishing went down during the pandemic, but what was interesting is different domains were affected in different ways. So again, perhaps unsurprisingly, happiness and life satisfaction fell pretty substantially, 0.7 of a point. Likewise with physical and mental health. Financial and material stability fell very substantially during this time. In June 2020 was the height of unemployment in the United States. But interestingly, some of the other domains did not decline as much. Meaning and purpose went down a bit, but not as substantially as those others. Our character assessments were pretty much level. And somewhat surprisingly, the close social relationship assessments went down a little bit, but not all that much, not as much as would have guessed. And this was corroborated by other data which had suggested during the pandemic loneliness went up a bit on average, but again, not as much as one might have guessed. And so while for some this was unquestionably a difficult period. For others, it led perhaps to greater investment in family or those one was living with or connecting with relatives. Importantly, these means do disguise variability, and the standard deviation, the variability across these domains, went up during the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, while for some this period might have been one of deeper relational investment, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this may have been an especially challenging time. So important not just to look at the means, but also the distribution of these flourishing assessments. We've continued to collect this data each year. By January of 2021, there had been about a halfway recovery to former scores. By January of 2022, and this was still in the midst of Omicron, these flourishing scores had more or less returned to their pre-pandemic levels. However, a new pattern emerged with that data in 2022, and that concerns its relationship with age. Traditional well-being patterns with age have tended to be U-shaped. Most of this is focused on happiness and life satisfaction. But with that data, it has looked like younger people and older people tend to be happier, and those in midlife, perhaps struggling with young children and career challenges and aging parents, report lower levels of happiness. But what has happened over time is that left part of the U has been flattening. And in January 2022, for the first time, we saw, in fact, each of these domains strictly increasing with age. Young people are not doing as well as they had been. The 18 to 25-year-olds across these domains said that they were doing the worst. So I think this raises important questions with regard to what is taking place and why. How can we better support the well-being of young people? We've been doing similar data collection in a variety of different settings, workplace settings, employees at Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, China, a group of international flight attendants. This has now been taken by all Delta Airline employees as well. We've also embedded it for research purposes into a variety of cohort studies. The Nurses' Health Study at Harvard is now making use of these measures. The LSPAC study in the UK, the Japanese Aging and Gerontological Epidemiologic Study, various clinical settings, various universities, including Yale, Michigan, Stony Brook, New York University, West Point. Haven't yet convinced Harvard to do this in a broad way, but hopefully in the years ahead. Secondary schools, a national survey of Catholic priests, and a global flourishing study that I'll be mentioning momentarily. Some of the patterns that emerged, in addition to the one concerning age, at least in Western context, is that, again, financial and material stability is often ranked the lowest. Not in all settings. This was not the case with our sample of employees at Aetna, nor the case with our samples in Denmark or Germany, but in many contexts, those financial and material means people really are struggling with. Attention needs to be paid to these questions as well, of course. Social connectedness assessments seem to be lower in this country than just about all others, which I think should give us pause for reflection. Are we valuing the right things? Also, interestingly, while happiness and life satisfaction tend to be higher in richer developed countries and poor developing countries, the reverse is the case with meaning and purpose, which tends to be self-reported higher in poor developing countries than the richer developed world. So I think this raises questions with regard to how can we go about carrying out economic development in ways that do not compromise meaning and purpose. To try to address some of these questions, we have launched with Gallup and also the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, a global flourishing study. This will be a cohort study of 200,000 individuals in 22 countries, representing about half of the world's population, with nationally representative sampling within each country and following up this cohort of 200,000 individuals once a year for 5 years. And so we hope to be able to better understand the distribution of flourishing, but also the social, economic, political, family, religious, psychological determinants of well-being to try to discern how we might go about improving it. This will be an open access data resource hosted by the Center for Open Science, so anyone who wants to make use of it is free to do so. First wave of data collection is now complete with about 202,000 responses and will be released February 13th on the Center for Open Science website if you want to take a look. So we're very excited as to what we may learn about flourishing in this coming year. I now want to transition to ask questions, not just how might we study flourishing, but given what we know even now, what might we do to improve, to enhance flourishing? And I'll begin more at the individual level, and then I'll talk about community and institutional engagement, and then conclude towards the end, trying to take an even broader societal perspective. But at the individual level, there have been a number of essentially do-it-yourself positive psychology interventions that have been evaluated in randomized trials, the same sorts of designs we use to assess cancer treatments or the effects of vaccines. And these various easily implementable activities have been found to increase various aspects of well-being, of happiness, of health. So as examples of some of these, one is a sort of a gratitude activity. This is perhaps the best studied of these well-being interventions, but this has been evaluated in dozens of randomized trials. The activities vary a little bit, but as one example, it might say 3 times a week, write down 3 things you're grateful for and why. Do this for 6 weeks, and if you compare that to a neutral writing activity, the group that carries out the gratitude activity has higher levels of happiness, lower levels of depressive symptoms, better self-reported sleep, lower self-reported health symptoms, with some of these outcomes persisting even 6 months later. We do this in our family over the dinner table as well, which is another, I think, helpful context, and I feel I can notice weeks where we fall off our practices of doing this. So again, I do think this is something that's easy to implement, that we know from research now can enhance well-being. Not huge effects, but meaningful. And if employed more broadly, I think population well-being could increase. Another of these activities, acts of kindness. Choose 1 day a week and try to carry out 5 acts of kindness that you wouldn't otherwise do. And it can take quite a bit of advanced planning to try to get all 5 in a single day, but the research suggests that that's more effective than spreading them out over the course of the week, perhaps better at forming of habits, focusing the mind on those acts of kindness activity. Again, randomized trials indicating higher levels of happiness, of social connectedness, of a sense of flow than those randomized to a more neutral activity. Another one is kind of identify your central character strengths. The University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology website has what they call a values in action survey to identify top 5 character strengths out of a list of 24. And the exercises try to use each of these in a new way once a week. And likewise, randomized trials indicating that even 6 months later, those who practice this have higher levels of happiness, lower levels of depressive symptoms. I think we also now have, using a similar approach, various resources to address not just these positive aspects of flourishing, but to try to address psychological distress as well. These resources really are not a substitute in any way for clinical or psychiatric care, but I think can be helpful in addressing more mild forms of depression or anxiety or anger. David Burns' Feeling Good book has been evaluated in quite a number of randomized trials with effects on lowering depressive symptoms. Fewer, but at least 1 or 2 randomized trials on Arlo and Krasky's mastery of your anxiety and panic. We've just completed a large randomized trial of a forgiveness workbook intervention, trying to distill about 30 years of work in clinical psychology on forgiveness into a do-it-yourself workbook format based on Everett Worthington's REACH model of forgiveness. This was a randomized trial of about 5,000 participants in 5 relatively high conflict countries, Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine. Indonesia and Hong Kong, and we found effects not only on increasing forgiveness, but on reducing depression, reducing anxiety, and increasing some of these self-reported flourishing assessments. So that's coming out in British Medical Journal Public Health in next month, I believe. So we have collected some of these various activities in this summary paper, Activities for Flourishing, which goes through the evidence in a bit more detail. We've also built a free Flourishing app to carry out implementation if anyone wants to take a further look at that material. So again, these effects aren't huge, but I think important, meaningful, and if these activities were disseminated more widely in workplace or educational or perhaps even certain clinical settings, I do think population well-being would go up, at least somewhat. Interestingly, however, if you look at the outcomes which these interventions tend to alter, they're pretty much always either happiness or some aspect of health. For some of those other flourishing domains, purpose or character or relationships, effects tend to be much smaller or non-existent. Many of the interventions that have been developed to try to alter purpose have failed. Much of this is not, in fact, published, but I think these other aspects of flourishing are more difficult to change. A little self-directed activity may not be sufficient. I think to enhance flourishing in these other areas, we may need deeper engagement in communities, longer-term commitments in relationships. And so I want to broaden our perspective a little bit to think about more communal pathways to flourishing. And I'm going to approach this question through the lens of my own discipline, public health. We often think of the public health impact of an exposure or an intervention or a phenomena as a function of two things. First, the prevalence of the exposure, how common is it? And second, the size of its effects. Something that is common in the population that has large effects on the outcomes that we care about is going to shape population health. And so if one takes this lens with physical health, for example, you're led to things like exercise and nutrition and not smoking and getting adequate sleep. But if we are to broaden the set of outcomes that we look at and focus not just on physical health, but also on happiness, on mental health, on meaning, on character, on close relationships. And we ask what's both common in the population and has large effects on across these various flourishing domains. I think the list looks rather different. And based on a review of the literature, which I'll get to momentarily, I would propose 4. And these are family, work, education, and religious community. There's evidence that each of these is common in the population, both in the United States and globally, and that each has relatively sizable effects across these various flourishing domains based on more rigorous research from longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs. The argument here is not that these 4 are exhaustive. There can be other very important pathways for flourishing for particular individuals. Deep engagement in the arts, for example, might powerfully affect each of those flourishing domains, but such deep engagement may be less common in the population. But the argument's not that these 4 are exhaustive, nor that they're necessary at the individual level. One can flourish even in the absence of one or more of these domains. Rather, the argument is that each of these powerfully affects those domains of flourishing, and each is common in the population, so that if individual and policy efforts were made to contribute to these various pathways, population flourishing would increase. So these 4 pathways were based on a literature review in that paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. If you'll forgive a kind of technical, methodological aside here, but the restriction was made in this literature review to longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental design. So there's cross-sectional designs where all the data was collected at the same time, which is the vast majority of studies in many of these areas. Those cross-sectional studies were excluded because one really can't discern causal effects from designs of that sort. We don't know which direction causality might run when all the data is collected at once. So as examples, long known that marriage and happiness are correlated, but is that because marriage causes happiness, or is that because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? And there's evidence for both, but again, with cross-sectional data, we simply can't tell. Likewise, religious service attendance is inversely associated with depression. But is that because religious service attendance protects against depression, or is it because those who are depressed withdraw from their religious communities and other forms of community participation as well? Again, evidence, I think, good evidence for both, but once again, from cross-sectional studies, we can't tell. So again, restriction to more rigorous longitudinal designs over time, or when we've been able to randomize or use natural experiments to try to discern causal effects. In some cases, this involved throwing out the vast majority of the literature. If one looks at religious service attendance and happiness at the time, this paper came out of over 100 studies on this topic. I could only find one that met these criteria. Fortunately, things have improved somewhat since then with regard to the quality of the research, but this figure from that paper gives those 4 pathways on the left, and then the various flourishing domains on the right, and these little numbers on the various lines correspond to references to, again, either longitudinal experimental or quasi-experimental studies suggesting evidence for an effect. In some cases, the evidence was quite substantial. In other cases, kind of only 1 or 2 studies seemed to be available at the time of publication, though, again, the evidence-based has strengthened quite considerably in the 7 years since this paper was published. I'll make a few brief remarks on what I see as potential policy implications of this framework. And I do think often policy is made through a lens of economics, sometimes economics and health. But I think if we look at not just health and financial considerations, but take a broader lens to flourishing, looking across these outcomes, sometimes at least our considerations may be altered. So as an example, I think welfare policy is very important in providing a safety net, providing the necessary material resources and health care to sustain people in periods of difficulty. But I think welfare policy should do its very best not to disincentivize work, for example, because while work certainly contributes to income, contributes to access to health care, work does a lot more than that as well. It often gives people a sense of meaning and purpose. It allows them to develop their character strengths. It provides a forum for social relationships. And so welfare policy, I think, should not disincentivize work if what we're aiming at is this fuller understanding of flourishing. So I think supportive employment programs for disadvantaged and mentally ill that help individuals find and sustain employment, and these programs have now been tested in a range of randomized trials, I think hold promise with regard to ensuring work is a pathway for many to attain flourishing. Another example would be in the family pathway, eliminating marriage penalties in the welfare system. So some states' welfare systems are such that if 2 people who are on welfare marry, they lose their benefits, which provides then a disincentive to marry. The empirical literature suggests that marriage itself is conducive to flourishing, and so I think we should structure welfare systems to eliminate these penalties. Another example is, while a lot of marital counseling is not evidence-based, that has been changing slowly, and there are now for example, evidence-based counseling programs that have been evaluated in randomized trials that could be disseminated widely at much lower cost, and for many, much less embarrassment. And again, I think this would sustain marriage and family as a pathway to flourishing. In education, I think ensuring all students have access to good teachers is critical, but I also think parental choice as to school type is important, with an acknowledgement that parents may be pursuing a variety of ends as well. With regard to preserving religion as a pathway to flourishing, I think ensuring religious liberty, retaining the tax-exempt status of religious organizations, correcting what I would see as unbalanced portrayals of religion in the academy and in the media. Certainly religious institutions have done harm as well, and I think that should be pointed out and rightly criticized. But I think there should also be attention to the many positive contributions of these communities as well. So these are just a few thoughts with regard to how this flourishing lens might be relevant for policy considerations. I will spend a little bit more time, since this is a Lumen Christi event, on this topic of religion, also because some of my own empirical research has focused on this question, so both with regard to what the research suggests, but also could we push these questions of intervention or policy a little bit further than I have done here. The evidence base for effects of participation in religious community on flourishing has continued to increase over the years. In 2020, we published a study from 3 large cohort studies looking at a host of different outcomes, again, suggesting fairly strong effects on at least a number of different health and well-being outcomes, which I'll come to momentarily. In 2022, we published a systematic review in the Journal of the American Medical Association, looking at the largest, most rigorous studies on spirituality and religion and health, likewise indicating strong evidence for at least some outcomes, such as mortality risk, depression, suicide, drug use recovery, and various other outcomes as well. And then just 2 months ago, we've published a handbook on religion and health, about 1,000 pages, kind of summarizing the whole of this literature, including some of the weaker studies as well. So again, the evidence-based has been increasing. At 1,000 pages, the book also makes a very helpful doorstop, or if you're having trouble with insomnia, it can also be very, very useful. At a mere $199 per copy, it's good that it has multiple uses. But in any case, the evidence has really been strengthening. And so I would say there is now evidence from rigorous longitudinal studies that participation in a religious community, essentially weekly religious service attendance, is associated with about a 30% reduction in all-cause mortality, about a 30% reduction in depression rates, 3 to 5-fold lower rates of suicide, higher levels of life satisfaction, higher levels of meaning and purpose, less substance abuse, less criminal engagement, greater levels of generosity, volunteering, civic engagement, pro-social behavior, greater social relationships, less loneliness, greater marital stability. So quite a host of outcomes. Not all outcomes, I would say the effects on cardiovascular health are somewhat less clear in terms of incidence of cardiovascular disease. Survival from cardiovascular disease, yes. Incidence, not as clear. More studies than not indicating effects on increasing body mass index. Perhaps those church potlucks with the fried chicken are not particularly helpful in that regard. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, nearly null or very small effects on anxiety. And this is for communal engagement, religious service attendance, rather than prayer or meditative practices. But for that community participation, while I think it probably does relieve anxiety, provide peace for some, for others it may create a sense of burden, additional requirements, and so it seems like the net effect on anxiety is relatively small. So again, not effects on all outcomes that have been examined, but quite a host of important outcomes. So I mean, I do think engagement in religious community is important for individuals. I think, but I think we can ask the question, are there further measures that might be taken at the societal level to enhance religious participation as a pathway? They certainly do want to acknowledge dangers of instrumentalization of religion. The primary focus of religious activity is generally not seen as the promotion of physical health, for example, but some notion of communion with God or the transcendent. However, I think in many cases, the spiritual ends of the various practices and also their contributions to physical, mental, and social well-being are in fact consonant. So I want to address a perhaps more controversial question with regard to, is there any sense in which it's meaningful to encourage such participation, and how might we navigate what are admittedly very difficult and complex ethical challenges around this? And I'm going to approach these questions from the lens of my own discipline, public health and medicine, And as sort of a way in, I would say at the very least, there does seem to be consensus in many settings that taking at least a very brief spiritual history may very much be helpful in clinical care. Palliative care guidelines are to inquire about spirituality, though this is still done infrequently. In psychiatry, I think it's important, both having religion as a sense of support and strength, but also religious considerations can be a source of tension and mental illness as well. So I think inquiring within psychiatry can also be useful. One study of cancer patients indicated that patients stated religion and spirituality as the second most important of 7 different factors in their own medical decision-making. Physicians rated it 7th out of 7. So there's a real discrepancy with regard to how religion and spirituality come into play in the life of a patient with regard, in contrast to how it's in fact being treated. So there have been consensus panels on end-of-life care and within psychiatry on the importance of taking a short spiritual history. There have been a few 4-question spiritual history inventories put forward. Clinicians are obviously very restricted in terms of the time they have available, so one might simplify and combine some of these questions, reduce them maybe even to 2. Are religion or spirituality important to you in thinking about health and illness, or at other times? Do you have someone to talk to, or would you like to have someone to talk to about spiritual matters? And these questions can be asked, of course, even if the patient and clinician do not share similar religious perspectives. But referrals could then be made if patients want to discuss these matters further as they relate to their own health care. Again, more controversial still, perhaps, would it ever be ethical to encourage service attendance within the context of clinical care? And again, I think we do have to be careful here about these issues of instrumentalization, abuse of power and authority, and to acknowledge that people, again, do not typically make decisions with regard to religious commitments around considerations of physical health. Rather, these commitments are shaped by experiences, upbringing, values, truth claims, evidence, relationship systems, meaning, and so on and so forth. However, I do think for those who already positively identify with a particular religious tradition, but aren't attending any sort of communal involvement, it would not, in general, be unethical to inquire whether a patient might consider re-engagement as a meaningful form of social participation, given the effects of health on well-being. Context certainly needs to be taken into consideration. Issues of abuse, for example, need to be appropriately handled and addressed. But again, I think taking a brief spiritual history might allow for the uncovering of such instances as well, and referrals can be made as appropriate. So I think potentially a sensitive, ethical approach to encouraging greater community involvement as a pathway to flourishing, even in clinical practice, and I think variations might be possible within public health as well, is to first take a brief spiritual history for those who have had past negative experiences with a religious community. Offer of referral to a chaplain or a counselor could be made. And then for those who do positively identify with a religious tradition, participation in religious community could be encouraged or inquired about. For those who do not, other forms of community participation could be encouraged. One sees similar, albeit smaller, effects on health and well-being for other forms of community participation as well. So I think an approach, something along these lines, might help for a deeper community participation, both in religious community and more broadly. I think especially in this period post-COVID, we are in great need of rebuilding our community life, and I think finding pathways to do so, even if it only is gentle encouragement, might be worthwhile considering. For those still skeptical, I think we could also turn the question around and ask, given the evidence on the effects of participation in religious community on numerous health and well-being outcomes, are we doing harm by withholding this information? I want to conclude presentation by taking an even broader lens. I've been speaking mostly about individuals' decisions to participate in various communities or institutions, but those communities themselves and the broader social structures that support them are of course, important. And I think this brings us to what might be drawn as a distinction between well-being and flourishing. And in much of my own writing and in communicating with popular media, I will often use those two terms, flourishing, well-being, thriving, interchangeably, as I think do most philosophers and theologians here, probably a bit more careful, but often these terms are used interchangeably. But I do think they have subtly different connotations. I think a term like thriving in some ways suggests doing well in spite of the circumstances, whereas I think the term flourishing suggests kind of a certain consonance with the conditions and the surrounding environment, a healthy growth, a blossoming of sorts. And so when we have at the Human Flourishing Program tried to distinguish these two notions of well-being and flourishing, we've done so as follows. The definition I had proposed earlier was essentially relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. If we were going to try to distinguish between well-being and flourishing, I would say well-being is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good as they pertain to that individual. Whereas flourishing is really the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the contexts and communities in which that person lives. So that the community's well-being is a part of one's own well-being, part of one's own flourishing as well. So we might say someone might attain some measure of well-being even in a corrupt environment and society, but that person's not fully flourishing because their community is not doing well. And so, again, thinking about it in this way, I think we need, in thinking about flourishing, to take into account the broader context, the various relationships, community, religious, governmental, infrastructure, economic, cultural factors that are shaping and supporting communities and shaping and supporting individuals. These are communal, societal, structural drivers of flourishing, but again, I think a case can be made that they are part of the individual's flourishing as well, by that individual's participation in a broader community and society. It can be challenging to try to operationalize this sort of notion with data, but we are making attempts with our global flourishing study, looking at notions of community belonging, city satisfaction, national government, but then also supplementing this with national level data collected by other data sources on questions of solidarity at the national level, agency, the broader economic context of that society, and environmental considerations as well. The global flourishing data is geocoded, so we're able to do this not just at the national level, but also more local, communal levels to try to explore these various contextual aspects of flourishing. So again, more hopefully in a year's time. Relatedly, and this is bringing me towards my conclusion, some of the future directions we are at present pursuing our first notions of community well-being, not just looking at the average flourishing scores for individuals, but as a community flourishing as a community, looking at this at schools, cities, workplaces, universities, hospitals, looking at not just individual flourishing, but also whether relationships within that community are good, whether the leadership is competent, whether there are healthy structures and practices in place to sustain the community, whether that community has a sense of belonging, welcome, satisfying community, whether it has a common shared mission or vision. So our work on this is at an earlier stage, but we've collected this data in a number of schools, in the process of doing some work with universities, a sample of residents in Columbus, Ohio, and in Santa Monica, interested in these notions of community well-being also. One of the important aspects of well-being, which is not part of our core assessment, notions of spiritual well-being. And for many who identify with particular religious tradition, this is really the most important aspect of well-being. However, I think to do this well, we really need tradition-specific measures, what's considered most important in the Christian tradition versus the Islamic religion versus Buddhist traditions look quite different. And so we've been doing work on trying to develop tradition-specific measures of spiritual well-being. We've also been doing more extensive assessments in some of these particular domains. 2 questions to assess all of meaning and purpose is, of course, relatively crude. And so when the focus of a particular study is going to be on a topic like meaning and purpose, one wants a richer assessment. So we've drawn on work both in psychology and in philosophy on these questions of meaning to do a richer assessment, distinguishing questions of kind of having an understanding of the meaning of life, which is sometimes in the psychology literature called coherence, versus having meaning in life, finding one's activities worthwhile, versus purpose or direction, which is more goal or end-oriented. And then finer distinctions in each of those. With regard to purpose, one might distinguish goals, simply things one wants to accomplish, versus purposes, which are larger life aims that help organize and generate those goals, versus maybe a singular life mission, which helps organize and generate those purposes. So we're working on more extensive assessments in each of these domains, including meaning and purpose, social flourishing, and various specific aspects of character. We have a large grant from the John Templeton Foundation to assess various forms of interpersonal love, looking at more traditional types of relationships, romantic or spousal relationships, parent-child relationships, but also love within friendship, love of neighbor, love of enemy, even. And so drawing on philosophical, theological traditions on these topics to try to do assessments on these different forms of interpersonal love, which to my mind is important if we are going to come together as a society. I do think that notion of love of enemy can be very powerful with regard to trying to restore relationships after frictions and tensions and help, I think, heal from some of the polarization we are experiencing. We've also tried to incorporate perspectives from non-Western traditions. While I would maintain that those 5 domains I presented are pretty much nearly universally valued, it still leaves open the question, what else have we missed? And some of our work with Gallup and the Japanese Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation has suggested notions of peace and balance and harmony as being universally desired, but given much more emphasis in Eastern versus Western traditions. So we've been incorporating these notions into, for example, the Global Flourishing Study. And then lastly, we've been trying to adapt these flourishing assessments to more specific contexts and populations. We have an adolescent assessment, which replaces a few of the questions with more age-appropriate assessments, and are currently working on an assessment for end-of-life. What does flourishing at the end of life look like? How might we go about assessing that as well? So in conclusion, I think flourishing pertains to all aspects of life. This is important personally, but I think should also help guide our research and our policy considerations. I think we should incorporate a broader set of flourishing measures into not necessarily all, but at least some or many of our studies. Methodologically, I think we should be looking at the effects of the exposures or interventions that we're studying, not just on a single outcome, but on a whole host of outcomes at once, to have a better understanding of which exposures and interventions more uniformly help improve various flourishing outcomes. I do think we need better research support in terms of government, university funding, hiring, promotion for a broader set of outcomes. I'm certainly all for the study of physical health and income, but I think we need similar levels of empirical rigor when looking at happiness or meaning or character or relationships. I think government should start doing a better job of tracking these measures, and there certainly have been some successes. The UK has incorporated some of these measures in their annual survey, and at least occasionally is making use of them in policy decisions. The OECD's been encouraging this. We've been behind, in my mind, in the US, but have now for, I think, 2 years started collecting some life satisfaction data at least. But again, I think we need to start looking at a broader set of flourishing measures rather than just focusing on GDP as the measure of how well we as a country are faring. Likewise, I think employers, medical centers, schools, universities could track flourishing over time and seek to improve it. I really do believe that what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and policies put in place to achieve it. And so I think we should be aiming for flourishing both personally and as a society. Concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and happy to take comments and questions.
Folks, happy to take questions now. We'll take a couple questions here in this room, and then we'll go to the questions from the live stream audience.
Ask your question to the mic. It's for the online audience.
Sure. My question is, you said that flourishing shouldn't be just dependent on GDP of the country. What do you think about? I think it brushed on the access to healthcare. What do you think about? Because you had a chart there, note there that welfare policies should not disincentivize work. The problem is if we work hard, we might lose our health care. You know, some of these people on Medicaid, they have a lot of anxiety that if they work, they might lose that safety net. And they have been criticized that this is a socialized medicine, or a communist-like society if we provide healthcare to everyone.
Yes, roughly something along the lines of how do we navigate the complexities of people needing health care, and yet for some it providing a disincentive, provision of health care sometimes criticized as socialized medicine, and so on and so forth. And I mean, I do think there are different systems of welfare, of healthcare provision as well that could function well. I don't think there's only a single right answer here, and I think this is something that, as a democracy, we try to collectively discern. But as we go about doing that, and again, I do think different systems could function well, I do think whatever welfare system is in place, as best as possible, and there are going to be competing priorities, but as best as possible to not disincentivize work. So if people are worried about losing Medicaid if they start working, then I think we've designed the system in a very poor manner. And so that's what I was speaking towards, trying to design those systems, whatever they might be, so as not to disincentivize work, because work doesn't just provide healthcare and income, but also opportunities for meaning, for relationships, for the development of one's strengths. And I think we should be promoting that as well.
So all the work you showed on religion and public health, I'm wondering how firmly you would stand behind the causal inference in that work. I'm a huge fan of your e-values, and if you took some of those analyses, which I'm assuming have pretty modest magnitudes, what would happen if you did an e-value analysis?
Yeah. So the e-value is a measure of robustness to unmeasured confounding in an observational study. Sort of how large would an unmeasured confounder have to affect both the exposure, in this case religious service attendance, and the outcomes, say all-cause mortality, to explain that association away. So many of these studies, for example, in the biomedical and public health literature, don't control for personality. And personality traits like agreeableness and conscientiousness are associated both with increased service attendance and with lower depression, for example. So you might ask, well, maybe personality explains it away. The magnitude of the effects does vary across these outcomes, but if you were to look at depression, for example, you'd have an e-value of roughly 1.8 or 2, depending on the study. So
that unmeasured personality factor, which is unmeasured, would have to increase the likelihood of service attendance by twofold and decrease the likelihood of depression by twofold to completely explain away the association. When you look at the actual magnitudes of studies that do have data on these personality factors, you're looking at risk ratios more like 1.2 rather than 1.8 or twofold. So I think for all-cause mortality, for depression, and for suicide, the evidence is in fact very robust. Moreover, for depression and suicide, there are also quasi-experimental designs using natural experiments that studies economists have published that have likewise provided evidence with a whole different set of assumptions. So I think for those three outcomes, along with the social relationship outcomes, I'd say the causal evidence is very strong. Life satisfaction, the effect sizes are more modest and I think could potentially be explained away. So I'd say the quality of the evidence varies quite a bit over these different outcomes, but for several of them, I think the burden of proof now strongly lies on the other side if one is skeptical.
Some of the policy implications of your recommendations, particularly as it relates to faith, could result in you being canceled at your fine university. I don't know if anybody's taken a look at where all this might lead, but it's interesting to me. If you take, for example, the churches, I go to a church that is declining in attendance, as is religion in this country. The implications of your research is a great marketing tool for any church. In fact, I would like to get it and help. Have you thought any about the application, the applied research? Arthur Brooks, at one of your, do you know him? I'm sure.
Yes.
I know him. He's done great stuff on happiness, but he teamed up with Oprah, and they now have a best-selling book that covers a lot of what you've talked about. You've been very careful to do those distinctions, but have you given any thought to how you might bring alive in the real world the changes that this calls for?
Yeah, some, and the time may come to more deeply engage the general public and the popular press, or to approach Oprah and see if she wants to do another book. But I'm not at that stage right now in my work and career. I feel the research itself needs to be done and needs to be done well. So I've had some engagement on these issues. Christianity Today, for example, published a piece that I wrote with another person at the Human Flourishing program, kind of working out some of the implications for churches themselves. We're working with a woman who's putting together both a book on this work, but also little pamphlets that churches can use to let people know about this work, but which again tries to take some of these more complex ethical questions seriously as well. So we've done some, but I'm not in the next few years at least going to transition entirely to a promotion campaign. I think it's really important to have research done on these topics. Yes. But we are doing some engagement, yeah, and would be happy to have this distributed further.
We'll take a question from the online audience, and then we'll come back to the room here.
So the philosopher Mortimer Adler, a Jewish convert to the Christian faith, in his book 10 Philosophical Mistakes, remarks that one mistake of modern philosophy is the tendency to substitute the psychological concept of contentment for the ethical concept of happiness. This substitution leads to a reductive understanding of human nature and its orientation to transcendence. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so I think this in some ways takes us back to those questions of what is flourishing and how is this really understood in a more holistic and well-developed sense across different traditions. Even the notion of happiness and how that is is understood, I think really does vary. And in the work here, we're presenting happiness as essentially being used in the psychology literature, either in an evaluative sense, I have a happy life, I'm satisfied with my life, or in a more affective sense, I feel happy. And people care about these things, but even life satisfaction doesn't sort of explain all people's decision making. People might knowingly sacrifice their overall life satisfaction for the sake of a relationship, or in order to do the right thing, to make a moral decision, or for a purpose that they think is really important in the world. And so, I think sort of well-developed notions of happiness from the classical and Christian tradition understood as kind of the complete satisfaction of the will, the full flourishing, that towards which all of our actions are directed, is more expansive than any of these domains that I've been presenting here. I think each of these is a part of that more expansive, grander vision of flourishing, and I think worthwhile assessing. I think it's worthwhile thinking about what we do hold in common. But I don't see that as in any way necessarily restricting particular groups or communities or traditions from more clearly and more articulately expressing these grander visions of flourishing. So again, I would not say flourishing is reducible to these 5 domains, some of which are quite psychological. But I do think each of these, understood in the right way, is a part of what flourishing in this life looks like.
My question has to do with challenged, shall we say, challenged communities. Challenged communities, say, in Chicago, a place like Englewood, and there are numerous others that we could cite where flourishing and well-being is long gone. It would be interesting for you to take a research project into a community like that, or on the international scene, the warring communities that pepper our news reports on a daily basis. How do we transition from research like this to real world communities in deep need?
I think that's a good question, an important question, a challenging question, and I don't want in any way to suggest that the translation is straightforward. I do think some of this work could be used from the perspective of how do we prevent communities from disintegrating? How do we prevent those internal that internal strife that sometimes leads to civil war within a country? I think when a community itself is flourishing, that disintegration at the individual level is less likely. So I think some of this could be viewed as almost through a preventive lens. With regard to what happens when a community itself has already reached the point of struggle or collapse, I mean, I think some of these frameworks are not adequate. How to deal with war, these flourishing assessments aren't going to be particularly helpful. How do we recover after war? How do those processes of forgiveness potentially play out in a place like the Ukraine? I think these frameworks can be quite helpful. And then the final comment I will offer is that I think sometimes these assessments can reveal not only the challenges and problems within communities, but also their strengths. So when we've done this sort of data collection and we've looked at racial differences, for example, we see the standard patterns of health and income disparities comparing black and white populations. But if we switch the outcome and we look at social connectedness, or at in many cases, the character assessments, we find that Black individuals in these communities are reporting higher than white individuals. And so I think it's making clear some of the strengths of these communities as well, and what we may have to learn from them. I think likewise that result that assessments of meaning and purpose are higher in poorer developing countries than the richer developed world should give us some pause with regard to what are they doing that we're not. So while I think they can uncover, these assessments can uncover needs which need to be addressed, and often there's no straightforward answer to how to do so. I think they can also make clear the strengths of these communities. So I'm not in any way proposing this is a framework to solve all of our societal problems, but really more a different lens of looking at some of those problems, and of what we're trying to achieve. Is what we're trying to achieve simply the end of war and pulling someone out of poverty? Those are important and good, but are we trying to achieve something more as well? A sense of community, a sense of connectedness, trying to shape the community so that people are seeking after each other's good. Again, that doesn't answer any of the difficult questions you've raised, but I think provides a different way of looking at it, while also making clear what sometimes are strengths, even in very difficult and challenging circumstances.
We're going to start working our way down.
So your seventh aim is we should aim for the flourishing of individuals and communities. I'd like to focus on the community part. How do you measure whether a community is flourishing? Are there longitudinal studies to that effect? I take it it's something different than just the sum of the flourishing of the individuals that are in the community. But to repeat, how do you measure whether a community is flourishing, or how much they're flourishing, and how that changes over time?
Yeah. So what we've been trying to do at present in these community well-being assessments is that, in addition to looking at whether the individuals in the community are flourishing, we ask questions along the lines of what are the relationships within the community like, not just one's own relationships, but the person's assessments of the relationships as a whole in the community. Are those characterized by respect, by trust, for example? But then we also look at questions of leadership. Are the leaders able to inspire others with their vision? Do they genuinely care about the well-being of their community? Do they have the skills and capacities to lead and guide the community well? So these are still subjective self-report, but it's asking then people's assessments of the leadership of the community. Again, are there structures and practices in place to sustain the life of the community, to resolve conflicts when disputes come up? Are those working well? Likewise, is there a sense of belonging, of welcome in the community? Is it a satisfying community to be a part of? And then is there a shared understanding of the mission or the purpose of the community? Is the community one a sense in which the whole is more than the sum of its parts, where the community can do more together than each could individually? So these are the sorts of questions and assessments we're trying to use. This was developed by trying to abstract from what seems common across different types of communities. So we have these sorts of questions formulated for workplaces, for schools, for families, for religious communities, for cities, for nations. I do think there's probably an important role to supplement some of these assessments with those more targeted to the particular type of community that it is. But I think there's a lot kind of at the more formal abstract level that is common with regard to what a flourishing community looks like. So we don't have longitudinal data on this yet, but we do have this in a number of different community settings, again, trying to understand how these measures are functioning and how they could be used. But we're hoping to do more of that in time, in due course.
So I'm seeing many hands come up, and I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all the questions, but we've got a number of students in the audience. I'd like to give a chance if there's any student who'd like to pose a question. Katie.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I had a question if you either have, through your program, done research on or are aware of research that distinguishes what counts as work right? For like the kind of work that constitutes human flourishing, because there's a lot of, I'm studying history, and in the discipline of history, we're very down on all forms of, like, we're very big into labor unions, but we're very down on industrialization and all the things that are like the kinds of work that don't give people meaning in their lives. I'm also wondering what counts as work from the perspective of, say, religious communities maybe have people who are more happy, but they're also more likely to have women who don't work because they stay home with children. So is that considered to be work? Is there any kind of study about what kind of work contributes to flourishing, or is that not a direction that research has gone in yet?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say to date, most of the at least more rigorous longitudinal studies are essentially just looking at paid employment, which I would consider as a subset of that broader category of work. So transitions from employment to unemployment, what happens as a consequence of a job training program. This is where we have the strongest evidence. We are certainly interested in expanding that scope of what is understood as work, and have been looking at various forms of volunteering and informal helping, which I think, if done in systematic or extended ways, would likewise qualify as work. I likewise think caring for children is one of the most important forms of work if we're thinking about the future flourishing of society. And I think more good longitudinal research needs to take place on those sorts of topics as well, the contribution of that form of work, both to the flourishing of children and to that of parents. So I think each of these is potentially promising. There's been work on kind of working conditions, and that's a better developed area of research, and what sorts of working conditions do facilitate flourishing. I think we probably need more research on when does the positive contribution of work turn negative? When does it become too much? When does the extent of work, in fact, start impeding flourishing? So there are lots of directions this could be taken. I realize it's only a partial answer to your question, but at kind of a very high level, that would be my assessment of where the research on this topic is at present.
I think we've had one here for a little while.
I'm not a student. Yeah, I mean, you reasonably skirted all of the psychometric issues, but looking at those, the 10 questions you had us pause on, the one that I really paused on was one's own purpose. And I would think that question is not going to do well in cognitive testing, that people will read completely different things into it. And that could, in fact, be why lower income countries do better than higher income countries on a question like that, because they're seeing something different in it. And what, do you have some information about what people are thinking about when they answer that?
Yeah, I mean, we do, and I would say there is variability. There's variability across the other questions as well. We have cognitive interview data in all 22 countries, and I would say there is not a uniform interpretation of many of these indicators. In the Global Flourishing Study research, we're essentially treating each country as a separate analysis, and effectively as its own study. We will be aggregating results but via meta-analysis, but more along the lines of thinking these are closely related questions, but in different cultural contexts. They're really not assessing exactly the same thing. So I'm actually quite skeptical with regard to claims that any psychometric analysis or form of cognitive interviews could somehow establish that the questions are being understood in the same way. I don't think that's the case. With regard to what conclusions can you then draw about cross-cultural comparisons, I think when you start looking across multiple questions, and we have a lot more in the Global Flourishing Study than just these 12 questions. We have a set of probably 30, 35 different well-being questions. But when similar patterns emerge with different types of questions, so we have one on meaningful activities and the other on more cognitive understanding, one's purpose. When similar patterns emerge with the different questions, I think that strengthens the sorts of claims one can make, even though I think it's very difficult to do those cross-cultural comparisons and make absolutely definitive claims. I guess another related question concerns kind of self-report of these assessments, and sometimes the objection is raised specifically with the character items. I mean, surely people are exaggerating, and self-report, self-deception, social desirability biases come into play, and I do think that that is the case and needs to be acknowledged. And yet I do think we're getting some interesting information across those assessments. That one character item, I always seek to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. And a few of our studies has been the most predictive of subsequent well-being, controlling for baseline well-being of the indicators. And so while I think everyone's probably exaggerating, and while what should have been a 5 and a 7 were self-reported as a 7 and a 9, the fact that someone said 7 and someone said 9 actually gives some important information. So I think it's good to treat all self-report assessments with a healthy dose of skepticism, but I think many of them are actually picking up on at least something, and provided one is aware of and acknowledges the limitations of those assessments, I think they can still be quite useful.
One final question, Professor VanderWeele. You've spoken eloquently about the ways in which religious communities can contribute to human flourishing. Can you say a few words about what the Catholic intellectual tradition might contribute to our understanding of human flourishing?
In the final 60 seconds that we have. I mean, for me, the Catholic intellectual tradition has very much shaped my thinking about these topics, drawing principally on reading and reflection upon Aquinas and his description of the incomplete happiness that we can have in this life and what it consists in. Versus the final perfect happiness, and God actually helped shape the flourishing assessments themselves. I think also the Catholic intellectual tradition in its social teaching provides what I see as a very helpful roadmap to flourishing within society with regard to the role of family, with regard to the important role of work, of economic systems, of politics, of seeking to address these questions of war, in peace. So I think it, again, provides a very helpful and powerful set of ideas with regard to how society might be structured. And then lastly, as a Christian, as a Catholic, I do very much believe that the flourishing in this life is only part of what we should be aiming for, and that there is what Aquinas describes as a more perfect, a complete happiness in God, and that I do think is the central role of our churches, of religious communities, what we're aiming for. That, of course, is rather more difficult to empirically study with data, so in many ways we are restricted to the imperfect happiness or flourishing of this life. But again, I think returning to those rich understandings of flourishing in their fullness, not just reductively what we can measure, is important both in its own right and with regard to understanding, interpreting, qualifying what we can do both with data and with the promotion of flourishing here and now.
Before we close, I just would like to invite you all to a reception that we'll have outdoors. So if you didn't get a chance to ask Professor VanderWeele your question, you might still be able to nab him and see if you can chat with him a little bit. Thank you to you all for joining us, and let's thank Professor VanderWeele.